Coming up on Primetime News, North Korea calls off UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon's planned visit to the inter-Korean Kaesong Industrial Complex and claims the regime has the ability to miniaturize nuclear weapons. And that controversy flares up again as a U.S. military official says Washington is mulling over permanently stationing the American missile defense system in South Korea. While Japan wriggles its way out of slow growth by aggressively implementing structural reforms and stimulus measures, Korea struggles to do the same. Stay tuned for these stories and more. It's 10 p.m. on Wednesday here in Korea. Hello and welcome to Primetime News. I'm Hwang Ji-hye.
And I'm Daniel Choy. Thank you for joining us. North Korea does it again.
And predictability in the unpredictability, Pyongyang pulled the rug from under UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon on Wednesday morning, suddenly withdrawing an invitation to visit the jointly run Kaesong Industrial Complex.
And the South Korean government and political leaders denounced the move, while the diplomat-turned-UN chief called it a deeply regrettable decision. Our Kim Young-gil starts us off.
Ban Ki-moon could have been the first UN chief to visit the reclusive state in 22 years, as well as the first UN chief to visit the factory park in the jointly run Kaesong Economic Zone. But those firsts weren't a consideration for North Korea.
I was notified through diplomatic sources that North Korea had canceled their approval for me to visit the Kaesong Industrial Complex this morning. There were no explanations given. Pyongyang's abrupt decision is deeply regrettable.
The Kaesong complex, which started operating in 2004, is the last functioning symbol of inter-Korean reconciliation. Ban said he will make every effort to encourage Pyongyang to work with the international community for peace and stability on the Korean peninsula. Seoul's Unification Ministry echoed his view and urged the regime to avoid walking the path to international isolation. North Korean experts say the retraction may have been a deliberate diplomatic discourtesy meant to show displeasure over Ban's criticism of Pyongyang's military aggressions. In a meeting between Ban and South Korean parliamentary leaders on Wednesday morning, Assembly Speaker Chung Hee-hwa said the cancellation is a discourtesy to the UN. He urged North Korea to invite the UN chief to Pyongyang as a gesture of apology. While at the assembly, Ban called for South Korea's parliament to support the UN's push for climate change, sustainable development, and the adoption of universal humanitarian values by 2030. Relations between Seoul and Pyongyang remain strained following the North's persistent missile tests and nuclear arms development. Kim Young-gil, Arirang News.
And tensions escalate even further as North Korea says it's able to make nuclear weapons small enough to arm ballistic missiles and warn the world not to challenge its righteous efforts to fortify defense capabilities. In a statement today, Pyongyang's National Defense Commission claimed it had hit this milestone long ago and that it can now guarantee high-precision, intermediate, and long-range rockets. However, Seoul's defense ministry says the North is not fully capable of miniaturizing nuclear weapons and warned that Pyongyang should immediately halt all provocations that breach UN Security Council resolutions. The news comes a few weeks after the reclusive regime reportedly succeeded in test firing an SLBM or submarine-launched ballistic missile. But more international experts are raising doubts over that claim. James Winnifield, the vice chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, said the North manipulated its recent test launch video to exaggerate SLBM development progress. During a discussion in Washington on Tuesday, the U.S. military official stressed that Pyongyang is years away from having such capability. And to counter these threats coming from North Korea, a senior U.S. military official says Washington is considering a permanent THAAD deployment to South Korea. But Seoul says it will start weighing its options after the U.S. submits a formal deployment request. Kim Hyun-bin reports.
Frank Rose, the U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Defense Policy and Verification Operations, said that Washington is weighing the costs and benefits of deploying the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System, also known as THAAD, to South Korea, but stressed the final decision has not yet been made. Rose, who made the remarks Tuesday at a security seminar in Washington, said THAAD is a purely defensive system that will improve the Allies' ability to intercept incoming short and mid-range missiles from North Korea. In response, South Korea's presidential office said that the government will assess the pros and cons and come to a decision if the U.S. makes a formal deployment request. Admiral James Winfield, the U.S. Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, says if the two countries engage in talks, Washington will approach the issue with discretion and respect Korea's decision.
And it goes without saying that the ROK will have to want to have this system in place, or we simply won't put it there.
The potential deployment is a thorny issue in and outside of South Korea. Both China and Russia have voiced opposition, calling it a threat to their national security. Responding to their concerns, Rose said it does not and cannot impact broader strategic stability for either country. Kim Hyun-bin, Arirang News.
The Korean War ended with an armistice, not a peace treaty. That fact isn't felt by most people going about their daily lives, but for South Korea's 82nd Battalion, it's the backbone of daily life. Our Na Young-kyung has the story.
This is one of the most heavily guarded borders on Earth, a clear reminder of the 7-decade-long division of the peninsula. This underground tunnel, dug by North Korean troops, is one of 4 discovered in the 1970s. The two Koreas are still technically at war, which is why South Korean men still do about 2 years of mandatory military service. With North Korea claiming to have miniaturized nuclear weapons and its reportedly successful test of a submarine-launched ballistic missile, the Korean peninsula is a little more tense than usual. The South Korean military must be ready to fight at all times, which means practicing wartime scenarios. The 82nd Tank Battalion pride themselves in being the nation's best battalion. About 300 soldiers are stationed here, and they conduct this kind of exercise twice a year to boost military readiness. More than 30 tanks, including K-1s, recovery, and commanding tanks, have been mobilized for this drill, taking place near the 82nd garrison. The training focuses on enhancing team cooperation, making sure soldiers in a tank understand and effectively carry out the roles of each position.
The tank gunnery training improved our firing. I'm confident that our unit, even as of now, is capable of working together to fulfill any kind of mission.
Visitors and even locals often forget they're in a potential war zone. But they should remember that with rigorous training, South Korea's military is prepared to defend the nation against any possibility. Na Hyun-kyung, Arirang News.
During the Korean War, the U.S. dispatched the largest number of soldiers to South Korea among UN member nations and suffered the greatest loss of life. Our Connie Kim helps us meet some of the relatives of still missing American soldiers who are in Korea this week attending activities honoring their loved ones.
Not a day goes by that Sheila Batsioch doesn't think about her father. She's now 65 years old, but she still thinks about the day 64 years ago when he died. Staff Sergeant Joseph Doherty was shot down around Chodo Island in North Korean territory in waters over the Yellow Sea. He is one of thousands of men still missing in action.
He was in the Korean conflict on October 23, 1951. He was shot down on what's called Black Tuesday, which is the day that there was a huge loss of Air Force personnel that day.
Batsioch is one of 49 people invited to Korea this week by the Ministry of Patriots and Veterans Affairs.
To remember and honor those who have made the ultimate sacrifice during the Korean War, South Korea has invited dozens of families of brave servicemen who have yet to return to their home soil.
The group attended a ceremony at Imjingak on Wednesday, where a memorial to Korean War veterans was erected in 1975.
Although this ceremony, honoring the sacrifices of the missing war dead, is long overdue, it is important to acknowledge their sacrifices and achievements. But it's extremely regrettable that we haven't yet found the remains of the missing.
An estimated 54,000 U.S. soldiers are known to have died during the Korean War. Close to 8,000 are still unaccounted for. At the ceremony, the families experienced a rush of emotion when they were given pictures of their relatives from when they fought in the war. Many said it's given them a certain amount of closure to see the place where their relatives fought and to know what they were fighting for.
I wanted a little bit of closure. I also wanted to know what he died for. You know, he's missing in action. He's still missing in action. But I wanted to see what it was he died for. And this trip has been wonderful.
Connie Kim, Arirang News, Paju.
A state-run think tank has issued a harsh outlook for the Korean economy, slashing this year's growth projection to 3% from the previous outlook of 3.5%. The Korea Development Institute says, however, that even this 3% growth rate is only achievable if the government carries out planned structural reforms and the central bank makes additional rate cuts. If all these measures don't happen, KDI says the growth projection could fall even further to below 3%. The institute says domestic demand may be gradually improving, but warns the country's slowing exports may hinder those increases. And while Korean exports struggle in the face of slowing major economies like China, conditions at home are not looking promising for the local economy, especially as the government struggles to push through structural reforms. Those challenges are mounting as Japan makes headway on its sluggish growth. Kwon So-ah has the details.
Finance Minister Choi Kyung-hwan called for the fast implementation of economic reforms, such as a long-delayed update to the civil service pensions, in order for Korea's economy to recover at an acceptable pace. At a regular meeting with economic ministers Wednesday, Choi outlined how Japan has been getting its economy on track by easing regulations in the agriculture, medical, services, tourism, and other sectors. Since Korea and Japan share many socio-economic similarities, he said there may be some way to use the neighbor as a benchmark.
If we don't handle our problems properly, we may face a situation where Japan speeds ahead and South Korea crawls behind.
Choi also stressed the importance of tackling youth unemployment, saying the future of Korea's economy largely depends on young people. Korea and Japan's youth unemployment rates are diverging, as Japan's numbers have been improving since the second half of 2013. Experts say the shift is connected to Japan's reshoring trend, in which a growing number of Japanese companies that had production bases abroad are returning home, creating more jobs in the domestic manufacturing sector. But in Korea, the opposite is happening, as big-name companies are expanding overseas production.
In Korea, labor and land costs are quite high, meaning Japan's policies do not work in Korea's economic environment.
In Korea, the so-called wage peak system may be a more effective way to create more jobs for young people. The finance minister called for its swift adoption on Wednesday. Kwon So-ah, Arirang News.
In the political realm, the two main rival parties have agreed to continue negotiations on a contentious bill to reform the pension system for public servants, and they aim to pass a new bill by May 28th. The agreement was made at a meeting at the National Assembly on Wednesday between ruling Saenuri Party lawmaker Cho Won-jin and the main opposition New Politics Alliance for Democracy's Kang Gi-jung, both chief policymakers on a special committee on public servant pension reform. The Civil Servant Pension Reform Bill has been in limbo since earlier this month, when the presidential office rejected the party's original agreement to link the bill to reforms to the much larger national pension system that will raise national pension payouts by 10%. And prosecutors decided to not detain Governor Hwang Ji-hye of South Gyeongsang-namdo Province and former Prime Minister Lee Wan-gu, saying there's not enough evidence, to prove that they were directly involved in trying to cajole witnesses to change testimony. But prosecutors added that their investigation into the bribery charges will continue, saying an indictment decision for the pair will be made on Thursday. Hwang and Yi are facing charges of receiving bribes from late businessman Song Wan-jong, the former chairman of Gyeongnam Enterprises. More scholars from around the world are signing a landmark statement demanding Japan face up to its wartime history, including its sexual enslavement of women. According to our Son Jung-in, nearly 500 historians join in the efforts to demand Japan stop its attempts to whitewash history.
On May 6, a group of 187 historians from around the world, including the US, Europe, Australia, and Latin America, sent an open letter to Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, urging him to address Japan's history of colonial rule and wartime sexual slavery, a rare move by world-renowned scholars targeting a global leader. But it did not stop there. Since the letter was issued, an additional 269 scholars have asked to add their names to the list to support the effort. They include not only historians but also political scientists and literature and religious studies scholars. All of them support the evidence showing that Japan held tens of thousands of women against their will and forced them into sexual slavery under the systematic management of the military during World War II. The scholars also urged Japan to apologize for the suffering it caused other countries during the war and raise concerns about a new and counterproductive atmosphere within Japan that seeks to limit open discussion of history. The letter was sent just months before Abe is scheduled to issue a statement in August to mark the 70th anniversary of the end of the war. He is under mounting pressure from the international community to make a heartfelt apology for Japan's past wrongdoings. Son Jung-in, Arirang News.
Death has often been portrayed in works of art as an attempt to understand it.
And a famous opera on this taboo subject is being performed at this year's Korea Opera Festival, currently taking place at the Seoul Arts Center.
And our cultural correspondent Kim Ji-young got a chance to talk to one of the stars.
If death were to be expressed in song, then the opera Il Trittico, a masterpiece by Giacomo Puccini, would say it all. This omnibus work is comprised of 3 one-act operas. Each interprets death differently, as a state of hell, purgatory, and heavenly release. In particular, the soprano who stars in the second opera, Nun Angelica, played by Kim Eun-hee, stands out. In her aria, she expresses a desire to see her dead son before she meets her own death.
It's very powerful. That aria is a very powerful aria. Every single time I sing that aria, my heart's just beating like a crazy. Because, you know, the mother love's just overpowering.
Now, operas are known to have sad and dramatic endings, but in the finale of the Il Trittico, it somewhat ends on a comical note. Can you tell us more about the ending of the play?
In this opera, you have three kinds of death. And the last one has a little bit, you know, cynical approaching to death. Everyone has their eagerness and their, you know, hope, wishes that shows humans, you know, desire. So it shows a little bit, you know, oh, probably that's me. You know, you can see that, oh, that person's just like me, or my father, or, you know, my aunt, something like that. So you can really connect to some characters. It would be fun.
It's one of the 5 pieces at this year's Korea Opera Festival, which runs until June 7th. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
And for the top international headlines, we connect to Polly at the News Center.
Our focus today, Southeast Asian nations tackle the migrant crisis at sea. The U.S. announces the biggest auto recall in history, and nail salon workers in New York fight for their legal right to fair wages.
Paul, let's start off in Southeast Asia. Thousands of migrants have been stranded at sea for weeks, often with little or no supplies. What's the latest on this looming humanitarian disaster?
Well, a diplomatic solution is finally emerging from Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand. They've been criticized lately for turning away these poorly equipped refugee boats, but fears are rising that it may simply be too late for the thousands of men, women, and children just struggling to survive. The foreign ministries of the three nations held an emergency meeting on the migrant crisis in Kuala Lumpur on Tuesday. Following the talks, Malaysia and Indonesia agreed to offer temporary shelter to 7,000 migrants, but stress they would take no more.
Indonesia and Malaysia agreed to continue to provide humanitarian assistance to those 7,000 irregular migrants still at sea. We also agreed to offer them temporary shelter, provided that the settlement and repatriation process will be done in 1 year by the international community.
Thai officials offered to provide assistance to migrants needing medical help, but stopped short of saying whether they would be allowed to remain ashore. The majority of the refugees have fled from Myanmar and Bangladesh. And switching gears now, the U.S. government has ordered a recall of nearly 34 million vehicles over defective airbags made by the Japanese firm Takata. The National Highway Transportation Safety Agency made the announcement on Wednesday, describing it as the largest and most complex auto recall in American history. The Transportation Department also ordered Takata to cooperate in an ongoing safety probe and vowed to hold the company accountable.
Automakers and manufacturers have a safety responsibility that they must live up to. There are no excuses. We used the authority we had to impose a daily fine on Takata for failing to cooperate with our investigation. But the goal at the end of the day is not to collect money, it's to improve safety and to protect lives.
The recall affects vehicles from 11 automakers, including Nissan, Honda, and Toyota. Authorities say the faulty airbags have been known to explode with too much force, shooting shrapnel into the driver and front passenger. At least 5 deaths have been attributed to the defective parts. And finally, 2 manicurists in New York have filed a lawsuit against nail salons accused of breaking labor laws. The class action suit was filed in the U.S. District Court in Manhattan on Thursday. It claims that employees at 4 salons in the Upper East Side were paid less than $60 for 10-hour shifts and denied any breaks. Civic activist groups have called for stricter laws to protect workers' rights, saying violating businesses need to pay up.
When the law is not enforceable, it encourages unscrupulous bosses to continue stealing wages because they see that nothing happens, even when workers come forward. And it discourages workers from coming forward to file complaints, to say that there's a violation because they see that nothing happens when other workers do it.
Last week, the New York Times published a series of reports investigating nail salons across the city over the past year. It found shop owners routinely exploited and even physically abused staff, mainly from ethnic minorities. And that wraps up our look at international stories for now. I'll see you back here tomorrow night.
The whole country enjoyed a breezy, bright spring day today, and according to the East Asian calendar, tomorrow is Soman, which means summer should start to set in. And as if on cue, the temperature will rise tomorrow, jumping 4 to 5 degrees higher than today across the nation, with plenty of sunshine. So get your sunblock and sunglasses and hat ready to protect yourself from high UV levels. Also, don't forget to drink plenty of water to stay hydrated. On that note, let's take a closer look at the readings for tomorrow. The morning will start out similar to today, but the afternoon will get much warmer as the daytime high here in Seoul will rise to 26, and Daegu and Gwangju will peak at 29 and 28, while Busan will top out at 25 tomorrow. tomorrow afternoon. And as for the other regions, Daejeon and Jeju Island will see a high of 27 and 21, while Dokdo peaks at 22. Now, the gradual warming trend will continue through the week, and by Sunday, the high in Seoul could soar to 29. Well, that's all for the weather. Have a wonderful evening.
Well, the rat race, I don't mind it as long as I know exactly what kind of cheese I'm getting. Well, that brings us to the end of our newscast. Thank you so much for staying with us. This has been Daniel Choy.
And I'm Hwang Ji-hye. Please join us at the same time tomorrow. Goodbye for now.